When it comes to Trump and his party accumulating power in the House, Republican-led state legislatures have been doing a whole lot of work. But now the Supreme Court could take it to a whole other level. Today, the justices heard arguments in a case that could gut part of the Voting Rights Act. And if it does, that could drastically change the voting maps in the South, according to Slate. Republicans could gain up to 19 House seats thanks to one single court ruling. Joining our table now, Mark Joseph Stern, senior writer covering the courts and the law at Slate. The rest of our nightcap is still here. Mark, explain this to us. It's a wow just by the headline.
It's huge. The Supreme Court looks poised to gut what remains of the Voting Rights Act by giving states free rein to slice and dice Black communities and essentially gerrymander them into oblivion to ensure that white residents, even in states that have large minority populations, control the entire congressional map. And that would allow these state legislatures to eliminate pretty much every Democratic seat that is currently being held up and preserved by the Voting Rights Act's protections for Black voters. So, the Supreme Court is claiming that it wants to mandate colorblindness, but what it really seems inclined to do is deny the existence of racism, deny the reality that these states have long wanted to racially gerrymander their Black communities out of political power, and give those states a free pass to finally just gut all remaining political representation for Black and brown people within their state lines.
What about the timeline? A decision is expected next summer. So could this affect voting maps in the midterms?
So here's where I think the three liberal justices have a role to play. There is a tradition at the Supreme Court that they don't release an opinion until everyone has written their parts, including dissents. A dissenter can hold up the release of an opinion for months. That is just how it has worked for a very long time. I think that the liberal justices need to slow walk their dissenting opinions if the court is taking the step that I think it'll take, and ensure that this decision doesn't drop in January or February, but drops in June or maybe even early July at the end of the term, because by that point, many of these states will have already had their primaries. These states will have already sort of locked in their lines for 2026. And so if the liberals are able to slow roll this, then it wouldn't play a role in 2026 that much, but it would play a huge role in 2028. Democrats would essentially start off the next set of House races at a massive disadvantage to where they are now.
The Voting Rights Act was a landmark piece of legislation in our country's history. It was reauthorized by George W. Bush, obviously less than 20 years ago, with overwhelming bipartisan support. If this happens, what kind of message is it sending to voters? Besides, we hope you're not paying attention.
I think that's the problem.
It sends...
Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Mark?
I'm sorry, Mark, go ahead.
I think it sends a very strong message that white supremacy can simply persist in a toned down form. It can persist behind closed doors, and that, these state legislatures, which are pretty viciously targeting race in some of the maps they're proposing, can just do it and pretend like racism is over, that there's no problem. Just because Klansmen aren't marching in state capitals anymore, the Supreme Court seems to think it's okay to unleash this kind of assault on Black voting rights. And I just think it's a really disturbing message to be sending at a time when, thanks in part to the Supreme Court, minority voting rights are under the worst attack that they have been since the 1960s.
What do you think, John?
So I think you need to understand it in context. I think, the stakes here couldn't be higher because it's about part of a partisan power grab that Donald Trump has unleashed with mid-decade redistricting. Explicitly, the President of the United States, for the first time in our history, saying, get me 5 more votes. Texas, get me more votes, right? So it's trying
We've heard him say that.
He said it on camera, right? And so that's about trying to dilute the chances for the pendulum swing of power to move back to Democrats in the midterms. This is part of that effort. Right now, the Voting Rights Act, a lot of Republican legislators try to get around it with things called cracking and packing. Right? They try to play the Black vote. But you look at a state like North Carolina, which is currently trying to redistrict beyond its current redistricting. Their 10 out of 14 seats are Republican. In a state where Democrats narrowly outnumber registered Republicans and independent voters outnumber them both. So this is actually about reducing representation. And the Supreme Court, the same Supreme Court, this Chief Justice, said that partisan redistricting, there's no bounds on that. So you combine gutting what's left of the Voting Rights Act with a free rein for partisan gerrymandering, and you get an even more polarized, hyper-partisan country, and that's bad for democracy.
North Carolina is an excellent example because this is a state that routinely elects Democrats statewide and yet has a supermajority in the legislature. The other problem with this originalist interpretation at the Supreme Court, which we heard in oral arguments again today, is this idea that the founding fathers were colorblind and the Constitution was colorblind, so that the whole thing should just be colorblind. Right. They absolutely weren't colorblind back in 1776.
They were just, every decision maker was all white.
Correct. They were all exactly the same, some of whom had slaves. So it's the same thing that happened with affirmative action. It's the idea that you can't use race to remedy racial injustice. And this court has taken a position on this. I'm not hopeful that it changes. I think Mark is correct. The only thing that the liberals on the court can do is delay it. But I don't know where this ends, and it's going to be much more serious than the redistricting issue.
And it's a big part of the cultural shift, especially under the second Trump administration, where on one hand, you've got the renormalization of gutter racism, just things that are being said that shouldn't be said in polite company or in public or by officials. And at the same time, the Supreme Court kind of seeming to buy the argument that racism is over, that what was needed when the Voting Rights Act was first implemented is ancient history and we need to move on. And now it's really more just about representation and of the majorities.
What do you think?
Can I just add one more point?
Please.
I just want to build on what Ali said. I think it's so important to note this is a Supreme Court that just recently allowed ICE to use race and ethnicity as a factor to determine who to arrest, which individuals to stop randomly or not so randomly and demand papers from. And now it is poised to say that the government cannot use race or ethnicity in order to smoke out the existence of racism in voting and ensure that people of color have fair and equal representation. The hypocrisy here of when the court does and doesn't allow the use of race is absolutely staggering.
Well, next month, Californians are going to vote on a new congressional map that could actually give Democrats more seats. And now President Obama is off the benches, starring in an ad, encouraging people to vote for this new map, accusing Republicans of trying to steal enough seats in Congress to rig the next election. What is your take? I mean, it takes a lot for Obama to step back into the spotlight. He doesn't do it often.
He doesn't, but I think he recognizes that there's a vacuum that only he can fill right now because the Democratic Party doesn't have a leader until they have a new nominee. Look, I have always believed that we desperately need redistricting reform, right? We've only got around 2 or 3 dozen competitive seats in Congress. But we've seen blue states overwhelmingly pass redistricting reforms and red states take a maximalist, hyper-partisan approach. With Trump telling Texas and other Republican states to get them more seats, states like California, if you're going to have anything like equilibrium, have very little chance but to roll that back. I don't think that's good for our democracy in the long run. We're in an arms race. That is a dangerous thing for our democracy. In the short run, it may be necessary.
We have a shutdown. Lawmakers that don't look at each other, don't speak to each other, and don't work together. It's all terrible for democracy.
It's terrible for democracy. And at the end of the day, because of the Supreme Court decision that Justice Roberts wrote, we're going to need a constitutional amendment to deal with some of these structural problems that have been put in place, whether it's Citizens United or whether it's redistricting, because that's the only way to get this back from the brink.
But to be clear, there's a real effort at a constitutional amendment around Citizens United. I think it was in 22 or 23
it's called a group called American Promise.
Right.
Yep.
And that still looks like it's impossible. And that's the one that many people can agree upon. So how do we get to that? I mean, it's a great idea. I'm with you all the way.
What American history, every 50 years or so, there's a period where we pass a lot of amendments. When American democracy seems like it's got its back to the wall. We're in that place, I would argue. And something like actually, getting big money out of politics has broad bipartisan support. So I think it's about putting it back to the states. But we got to start thinking big again. We have to fundamentally rededicate ourselves to re-strengthening American democracy, and it's going to take constitutional amendment.
It has broad bipartisan support, just like closing the carried interest loophole does, just like stopping Congress from insider trading. But does any of it ever happen? No, because at the end of the day, lawmakers care about how they're going to raise money, who they're going to raise money from, and how they're going to make money themselves.